In the heart of Texas, where the sun bakes the earth and pride runs deeper than the oil beneath it, a wealthy ranch owner made a boast no one dared challenge until now. For years, the black stallion Diablo had broken bones, shattered egos, and sent the best riders limping away in defeat. Then came a man with nothing but a limp, a battered pickup, and a past he rarely spoke of. No one bet on him. No one believed he could last 3 seconds in the saddle. But what happened in the dusty corral that day would turn $1 million wager into a battle of wills and prove that sometimes the wildest thing in Texas isn't a horse at all. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. The sun was only just lifting its red gold crown above the horizon when Dusty Creek began to stir. The little West Texas town was usually slow to wake just a handful of early risers out feeding stock or sweeping porches, but this morning was different. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the land knew something worth remembering was about to happen. A thin layer of dawn mist clung to the yellowed prairie grass outside town, catching the light and turning each blade into a glowing thread. Beyond the weathered wooden fences, the land stretched flat and endless until it met the far-off purple smudge of low hills. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster called out twice, its voice breaking, followed by the faint metallic ring of horseshoes on hard-packed dirt. The air was cool now, but everyone in Dusty Creek knew that by midday, the heat would settle in heavy and merciless. At the far edge of town, Whitmore Stables was already alive with movement. The long, low line of weathered stalls gave off the smell of hay and warm horse flesh, while the wide circular corral stood waiting like an empty stage. Around it, rows of sun-bleached wooden benches creaked under the weight of early arrivals, cowboys in dust-stained jeans and boots, horse trainers from neighboring ranches, townsfolk who'd wandered in purely for the spectacle. The crowd's voices mingled with the soft clink of metal stirrups and the rasp of leather straps being adjusted. Somewhere to the left, a man ladled coffee from an enamel pot into tin cups for a few dollars apiece. Another sold hand pies from a wicker basket. There was the smell of frying dough, and underneath it, all the sharp tang of horse sweat. The atmosphere felt almost like a fair, if fairs came with the promise of blood bruises and broken bones. Everyone knew why they were here. No one wanted to miss the main event. At 7:15, the office door at the far end of the stables swung open, and a man stepped out. Charles Whitmore cut a figure people noticed tall, broad in the shoulders, dressed like a man who understood both money and horses. His crisp white shirt had been ironed that morning. His dark blue jeans showed no dust. His tan cowboy hat cast a clean shadow across his lined but still handsome face. On his right hand, he carried a coiled leather whip, not because he needed it, but because it looked good in his grip. Whitmore was the wealthiest ranch owner in the county, heir to land that stretched farther than the eye could follow, and known for two things: his pride and his appetite for proving himself better than anyone else. He didn't walk into a room, he took possession of it. As he crossed the yard toward the corral, the crowd shifted aside almost instinctively, opening a clear space in the middle. Conversations hushed. Eyes turned his way. The corners of his mouth curled in a smile that said he knew exactly what effect he had. He climbed the few steps to a rough wooden platform beside the corral, set his boots shoulder-width apart, and tapped the whip against his left boot twice. The sound snapped the last of the chatter. "I've got something worth your time," Whitmore announced, his voice carrying across the yard with the practiced ease of a man used to being heard. $1 million. To the man or woman who can ride Diablo. The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before the crowd erupted into murmurs. 1 million. It wasn't a number folks in Dusty Creek heard every day. Whitmore let the noise swell just enough, then spoke again, his tone deliberate. "You heard me right, $1 million, Cash." From somewhere in the back, a man called out, "You sure about that, Charles? $1 million's a mighty big number." Whitmore's smile widened, showing teeth. "I'm sure. But I also know I won't be paying it." His gaze swept over the crowd, pausing on a few familiar faces. No one here's got the grit or the skill to stay on his back. On cue, the big double doors of the far stall were thrown open. 2 stable hands strained at the thick lead ropes, and out came Diablo. Even in the open air, the black stallion seemed to fill the space. His coat was the color of midnight oil, his mane long and ragged like a storm cloud, tearing free of the sky. The morning sun caught in his eyes, turning them into 2 burning embers. His neck arched, high muscles shifting under skin like coiled steel cables, and every step landed with a heavy, deliberate thud of hooves on packed dirt. The crowd as one took a step back. Someone near the front whispered, "That's the one that broke Mike Riley's arm clean in 2. Another voice, "Put 3 rodeo champs in the hospital last year. One of them still walking with a cane." The men at the ropes tried to keep a safe distance, but Diablo was already jerking against the leads, throwing his head, grinding the bit between his teeth. He stamped, sending up little clouds of dust, and a froth of white foam gathered at the corners of his mouth. Whitmore watched it all with the calm of a man, admiring his own creation. A couple of younger cowboys laughed nervously from the sidelines. "He's not that bad," one said loud enough for others to hear, but with a tone that dared someone else to prove him wrong. The older men, though, only shook their heads. One leaned on the fence and muttered, "Not worth it even for a pile of money that high. That horse will kill you before he lets you ride." The air in the corral was shifting now. The earlier fairground chatter had drained away, replaced by a heavy, watchful quiet. You could feel the line being drawn on one side, the $1 million prize. On the other, the black shape of Diablo, all muscle and fury. Whitmore crossed his arms, his smile turning sharper, almost predatory. The only sounds were the restless scrape of Diablo's hooves and the distant cry of a morning bird, quickly swallowed by silence. The dust hung in the sunbeams, turning the air gold between man and animal. Whitmore's eyes moved slowly across the gathered faces, as if he were scanning for someone foolish or brave enough to step forward. Each time his gaze met a pair of eyes, those eyes quickly dropped to the ground. Then Diablo reared suddenly forelegs, striking the air. And when his hooves hit the dirt again, he struck it so hard, the dust leapt into the sunlight, swirling like smoke. The stallion's wild gaze swept the wooden benches, and for a heartbeat, it felt as though he was sizing up the crowd just as much as Whitmore was. And somewhere in that restless, charged silence, the story that would shake Dusty Creek had already begun. On the far edge of Dusty Creek, where the paved road gave way to hard-packed dirt, the world looked older and more worn. Weathered storefronts with faded paint sat shoulder to shoulder, their hand-painted signs bleached almost white by years of Texas sun. A crooked barber sign swung gently in the breeze. Across the street, the old feed store's window was clouded with dust, the open sign hanging at an angle that suggested no one had touched it in weeks. At the corner of a crossroad stood Hank's garage, a squat building of corrugated metal and sun-faded red trim. The air around it carried the sharp tang of motor oil and the faint, bitter scent of burned metal. Somewhere inside, a wrench clattered to the floor, followed by the muffled curse of its owner. On the cracked concrete beside the garage, Jack Dawson pushed a wide broom across the lot in slow, steady strokes. The bristles whispered against the grit, leaving faint, clean trails behind him. Early sunlight slanted down over his shoulder, throwing long shadows that stretched toward the road. His shirt, a work-stained button-down, was rolled to the elbows. His jeans were patched at the knee. The heels of his boots were worn flat from years of use. Jack was 35, built solid through the chest and shoulders, but his walk carried a hitch, a slight favoring of his left leg that was impossible to miss. Years ago in Afghanistan, an explosion had torn through the Humvee he was riding in. The shrapnel had left its mark deep in muscle and bone, and though surgeons had saved the leg, it had never been the same. The sun had darkened his skin to a steady tan, but his eyes, gray-blue like a storm building over the Gulf, held a quieter story. In his right forearm, faded but still clear, was the tattoo of his Marine unit, an eagle globe, an anchor beneath a motto in block letters. Before he began work each day, he had a small ritual. He'd tug his left pant leg up just enough to check and adjust the metal brace strapped to his knee. It was a habit born of necessity and discipline, but it also reminded him where he'd been and what it had cost him. People in Dusty Creek knew him by sight, the quiet ex-Marine who kept to himself, took day jobs where he could find them, and never joined the card games or beer nights at the tavern. He didn't talk much about his past. No one pressed him. Home for Jack was an old silver Ford pickup parked in the dirt lot behind Hank's. The truck's paint had gone dull years ago, and one of the side mirrors was held together with duct tape. Inside the cab was tidy but sparse, a small duffel of clothes, a metal toolbox, and a framed photo kept wrapped in an old t-shirt. In the picture, a younger Jack stood beside his father, both of them smiling broadly. His father's arm was thrown across the neck of a tall gray gelding, the pride of Dawson's riding school, the little horse training operation they'd run together back when life was simpler. Those days had ended abruptly. His father's sudden heart failure had left Jack with debts he couldn't cover, and within months the riding school had been shuttered. The horses were sold. The land sat empty. Since then, Jack had taken whatever work came his way, mending fences, hauling feed cleaning lots enough to keep food in his stomach and gas in the truck. That morning, as Jack swept the garage lot, an old radio perched on a shelf inside the open bay door crackled to life. The speaker popped twice before the voice of the Dusty Creek morning announcer came through bright with excitement. Hot news from Whitmore Stables, folks. Charles Whitmore himself has just laid down a challenge, $1 million cash to anyone who can ride his black stallion Diablo. The fiercest horse in West Texas, maybe the whole state. The man's voice rode the edge between awe and disbelief. A fiddle and steel guitar riff swelled briefly beneath the words, the station's way of underlining that this was both news and entertainment. Jack's broom stopped mid-sweep. He straightened, listening. From inside the garage, Hank, a man built like a barrel with a baseball cap, pulled low, poked his head around the door. You hear that he said, grinning. $1 million just for sitting a horse. Sounds like the craziest payday in history. Jack's mouth tugged into a faint smile, but he didn't answer. He turned back to his sweeping. Still, something had flickered in his eyes, so brief you could almost miss it. At first, he dismissed it for what it probably was, another Whitmore stunt. Charles had a reputation for this sort of thing. Grand gestures meant to draw a crowd, stoke his own legend, and remind everyone how deep his pockets ran. But then, the number rolled around again in his head. $1 million. It wasn't just a big number. It was possibility. It was freedom. He could clear every cent of debt still tied to the Dawson land, the ground where his father had taught him to ride. He could rebuild the riding school from the ground up, new fencing, fresh paint horses brought in from good bloodlines. And with the right surgery, maybe the brace could go in a drawer for good. A memory stirred him as a boy, barely big enough to grip the reins, his father's steady voice in his ear. The smell of sun-warmed leather. The sound of hooves drumming a steady beat across open pasture. That was before sand and gunfire and smoke had replaced the sound of the wind in his ears. His lips moved without thinking, "He's just a horse." The words were quiet, but carried a weight. In the Marines, he'd handled worse than a temperamental stallion, explosives, armored vehicles, even half-wild horses they'd captured and trained for patrols in terrain machines couldn't cross. Maybe Diablo was mean. Maybe he was dangerous. But Jack had known dangerous before. The radio was still going, and the announcer riding the wave of his own enthusiasm. "And the gates will open at Whitmore Stables this afternoon for anyone bold enough to try their luck. You won't want to miss it, folks. This is one for the history books." Jack set the broom against the wall and glanced toward the highway that ran past town. Even from here, he could see a faint haze of dust hanging in the distance, drifting toward the Whitmore place. Early birds heading to get a good seat. He bent to pick up a cigarette butt someone had dropped near the pump, flicked it into the trash barrel, and stood for a moment, hands resting on the broom handle. The sun was higher now, burning away the cool edge of morning. Somewhere inside him, a decision was forming, not sudden, but certain. When he smiled, it was so slight, it barely bent the corners of his mouth. But the smile was there. By mid-afternoon, the Texas sun had burned away every trace of morning cool. The heat shimmered above the road, blurring the edges of fence posts and cattle in the distance. Each gust of wind carried the dry, metallic taste of dust, lifting it in slow curling sheets that drifted across the open land. Jack Dawson steered his battered silver Ford down the county road toward Whitmore Stables. The paint was dull and mottled the windshield, lined with faint cracks like spider webs. He didn't drive all the way to the main gate. He turned instead into a narrow stretch of dirt and parked half hidden behind a wind-worn mesquite tree. When he stepped out, the truck's door groaned. He pushed it shut with his hip, slid both hands into the pockets of his jeans, and started toward the stables. His limp was subtle but noticeable, the left leg lagging a fraction behind the right. The sound reached him before the stables came into view. The sharp, hollow thunder of hooves on packed dirt, broken by sudden bursts of shouting and the roar of a crowd. As he drew closer, the heat smell of horse and sun-baked wood wrapped around him. The corral was a churned-up mess of dust and hoof prints, the boards of the fence pale from years of weather. Inside, a young rider was airborne, his body pitched forward, his arms flailing in a desperate grab for reins that had already slipped away. He hit the ground hard, rolled twice, and came to rest on his side as his wide-brimmed hat sailed off and landed yards away. Two handlers sprinted in, waving their arms to shoo Diablo toward the far end of the ring, while they got the rider on his feet. The man's face was pale beneath a streak of dirt and sweat. His knees wobbled as they helped him out under the fence, the crowd giving a mixed chorus of applause, winces, and the occasional sharp whistle. You see that someone near the fence barked to his buddy. That's what the Black Devil does to you. Nobody's lasted longer than 10 seconds today. No sooner had the dust settled than another rider swung himself up into the saddle. This one was older, with a confident, no-nonsense seat. He snapped his boots into the stirrups, gathered the reins, and gave a quick nod. Diablo reacted as if he'd been struck by lightning, launching straight into a twisting buck, his back legs hammering the air, while his front hooves pawed at nothing. The big stallion spun, slammed his weight to one side, then to the other, like he was trying to shake a predator off his back. The saddle slipped a fraction, then more. By the time the count in the crowd reached 8, the man was sliding sideways, and an instant later he was down hitting the dirt with a sound that made several people groan. Blood shone in a thin red line above his temple as he staggered to his feet. He waved off help, but the handlers still escorted him out. Jack leaned an elbow on the top rail watching. He could feel the heat radiating off the boards into his arm. A burst of laughter erupted to his right. "Well, look who's here," a voice called. Jack turned his head just enough to see a small knot of local cowboys, sunburned and grinning like they'd just been handed free beer. "Dawson," one of them drawled. "You think that horse is the Taliban or something?" That set the whole group laughing. Another chimed in between chuckles. "Better watch yourself, soldier, might bust up that other leg." Jack let his eyes drift over them once flat and unreadable, then back to the corral. He didn't answer. Diablo was standing square in the center now, nostrils flaring a long rope of foam swinging from the bit as he snorted. The stallion's chest rose and fell like bellows. Up on the platform, Charles Whitmore had been watching the scene below with the detached air of a man enjoying a private show. His gaze settled on Jack, and he seemed to size him up in a heartbeat. Whitmore stepped down from the platform and strolled to the fence, his boots making crisp, deliberate sounds in the packed dirt. "You," he called, his voice pitched to carry. "Who are you supposed to be? Think you're gonna do better than them?" The words hung in the heat, baiting the hook. Around them, heads turned. Jack's gaze met his level and calm. Whitmore let a faint smirk twist his mouth. "Or maybe you're just here to watch like the rest of them." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Jack straightened to his full height, shifting his weight off the fence. His voice was steady when he answered, "I'll try." It was only 2 words, but they cut through the noise. For a moment, the place went strangely quiet, like everyone had taken the same breath at once. Then the laughter came louder than before, sharper at the edges. You hear that someone yelled from the benches, "The cripple's gonna ride the devil," more laughter. A few whistles. Someone slapped the fence rail like it was the punchline to a joke. Whitmore's eyes narrowed, though his smile didn't fade. "Your funeral," he said lightly. He folded his arms. "Just don't cry about it when you're face down in the dirt." Jack didn't answer. He reached into his back pocket, pulled out a worn pair of leather gloves, and stuffed them into his front pocket instead. Then he stepped away from the fence and walked toward the gate into the arena. At the far end, Diablo seemed to sense the shift. The big stallion's ears pricked forward, his head turning toward Jack's approach. His front hoof pawed the dirt once, twice. In the shade of the stable wall, Emily Whitmore stood among a cluster of stable hands, her expression tightening as she recognized the man. She'd heard stories about Jack Dawson, the Marine with a busted knee who kept mostly to himself. Her gaze flicked from him to her uncle, then back. Something about the way he moved, slow, deliberate, without a flicker of hesitation, made the fine hairs at the back of her neck rise. The lowering sun threw a long, sharp shadow of Jack across the churned sand, its edges quivering in the heat haze. Around the arena, the murmur of voices swelled again as the crowd realized they were about to get another show. None of them knew yet that the real story was about to start. The corral's far doors banged open, and 2 stable hands in sweat-darkened shirts hauled back the iron latches. Beyond the stall's dimness breathed out a hot animal heat, and then the black stallion came shouldering through as if he were pushing against the night itself. Diablo stepped into the sun like a challenge. His coat drank the light and threw it back in a deep, oily sheen that flashed green where the rays hit just so. His mane long and ragged as a storm front lifted and fell with each breath, and his eyes blood-bright from strain and fury cut across the waiting ring. A hiss of breath tore from him, then another hotter, heavier. In the midsummer glare, it looked like pale smoke streaming from the engine of something built for war. He voiced a scream that rattled the boards. A couple of kids in the front row yelped and fell backward onto their bench. Even the old-timers men who'd pulled calves at midnight and ridden out hailstorms felt the jolt of it settle somewhere behind their ribs. With every step, the stallion pounded a fresh crater into the dirt, kicking dust into the air until the ring became a bright, swirling haze. Foam showed at his mouth. The bit clattered against his teeth as he yanked the lead rope so hard the handlers skidded boot heels, tearing lines through the sand. One handler tried to shorten his grip and bring the big horse's head around. Diablo snapped his neck the other way and ripped the rope through the man's palms. The man grunted and let it slide, rather than lose his fingers. The other handler swore under his breath and planted his heels, both men now barely suggestions at the end of a line attached to a force of nature. Near the gate, Charles Whitmore watched with the hard pleasure of a man whose confidence was being fed. He tipped his hat back just a fraction, narrowing his eyes at the limping figure waiting on the other side of the fence. "Last chance to walk away, Dawson," he called, voice dry enough to scratch. "I don't want to pay hospital bills." He pitched it loud enough for the crowd. Laughter crackled like brush fire. A couple of men nodded, as if he'd said something wise rather than cruel. No one here wanted another broken collarbone, another ambulance barreling down County Road 6 under the noonday sun. The gate swung inward on leather hinges, and the noise thinned as noises do when a story reaches the word "but." Jack Dawson stepped through. The limp was there as it always was, but today it felt less like a weakness than a fact part of him, not the point of him. No whip, no lariat. The only leather he carried was a scuffed pair of gloves tucked into his back pocket and the old boots on his feet. A cluck of disbelief clicked around the ring. "He's going in, Bear," someone whispered. "He's crazy." The late sun angled across the yard, slicing his shadow long and thin. He walked toward the stallion, as if walking toward a cliff's edge, aware of the drop and the wind and the stones below, but somehow still moving forward. At 5 yards, Diablo hit him with another scream, a thick, tearing sound that warned and promised in equal measure. He hammered his forefeet into the earth, jarring impacts that shook the loose boards beneath spectators' palms. His barrel heaved. White spit flecked his lips and spattered dark dots on the dust. Jack stopped. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his hands like a man at gunpoint. He simply stood, putting his weight on both feet evenly, letting his shoulders melt down a notch. His eyes held the horse's eyes, the way you hold a skittish animal's attention, without challenge, without fear, as if you were ready to listen longer than it was ready to speak. His breath moved in and out at an even pace, the way it does on the second night of a long patrol when you've learned that panic is a luxury you can't afford. He had learned that lesson on a road too far from here, with dust the color of dried blood and a sky that never cooled. He learned it again now, in a circle of boards with 1,000 eyes tugging at the corners of the moment. Diablo's fury didn't vanish. Fury like that never does. But it thinned the edges, softening just enough for the crowd to feel the temperature drop by a degree. The front hoof that had been striking like a hammer began to find the ground and stay there longer. The head that had been slashing left and right settled half an inch toward center. One ear tipped forward. What the hell is going on? A cowboy breathed too low for anything but the fence boards to hear. He's never stopped pawing for a stranger, someone else whispered. Not once. On the rail, Emily Whitmore squeezed the top board, knuckles pale. She felt the second hand of her heartbeat tick to a slower time, not because she trusted this to end well, but because hope is a habit the young can't quit. Farther down, Charles's smile had shortened to something thinner, something that required more jaw to hold in place. Jack rolled his shoulders, once then lifted his right hand to mid-chest, palm open, and turned slightly sideways like a man saying easy without the word. He slid the foot on his bad leg forward 1 inch and stopped. Diablo blew a gust at him, air hot as a forge, then inhaled it back as if scenting for explosives. The stallion's nostrils trembled. The cords of his neck etched out in ropes under the black coat. A gust of wind wove the dust into ribbons, ran its fingers through the horse's mane, tugged at the hem of Jack's shirt. Neither of them moved more than a breath. "You're just a soldier who got hurt," Jack thought, quiet as prayer. "Same as me." The stallion's ears shifted toward him. His head dipped the smallest measure, the kind of motion only a ring-quiet crowd can magnify into a prophecy. Somewhere, a child gasped, and then, when no explosion followed, giggled once and hid it behind 2 small hands. Jack nodded once the smallest answer to the smallest question and put his weight forward. 1 more step. The ring held its breath for both of them. He closed the last yards slowly, until Diablo's breath was the weather on his skin. Jack let his fingers drift up, no sudden angle, no fast line, knuckles first, as if the hand itself were curious. The stallion flared and snorted, head rocking an inch, but didn't whirl, didn't strike. He sniffed Jack's knuckles, then the heel of his palm, then the hollow beneath the thumb where the scent of a person lingers after every wash. "Easy," Jack murmured, voice a low river. "Easy now. I didn't come to break you." It wasn't a horseman's charm so much as a cadence taught by long nights and bad days the tone men use when the world has shaken them raw and they still choose gentleness. His hand touched the crest of Diablo's neck, barely there, a brush of heat against heat. Under his palm, he felt the drumming of a heart too big for a fence to hold, felt the braided steel of muscle warming against skin. The stallion didn't back away. He didn't stiffen. For the first time that morning or year, he lowered his head and pulled a breath all the way to the bottom of his lungs and let it go. A sound moved through the benches. Not words, not even a single sound more, like a room agreeing with itself that it had seen something. Jack stood in that hush for a few beats, his fingers combing the coarse roots of the mane, whispering nothing and everything. Diablo's ear tilted to catch the thread of it, the way a man leans toward a story he wants to keep. Jack edged to the left, slow, respectful, the traditional side for mounting. Diablo tracked him with an eye, but didn't swing his hindquarters away. Someone had cinched a saddle on the black earlier, tight and mean for the men who'd tried and failed. Jack laid his hand on the saddle horn, not to claim it yet, but to make the idea of weight a little more ordinary. "Just me," he said, and the ring felt the words as much as heard them. He gathered a thick fold of mane in his left hand. With his right, he checked the stirrup habit, not fear, and slid the toe of his boot into it. Then came the moment. Every onlooker leaned toward the moment the air goes thinner, he lifted. He didn't vault. He didn't throw a leg like a challenge. He gave the horse a second to feel the shift of his mass, then brought himself up and over, settling into leather softly enough that the saddle barely creaked. He kept his shoulders over the withers, his hips loose, his hands light, as if he were laying a coat across a chair rather than putting a claim on a living thing. Diablo did what Diablo does. He spun abrupt and tight, testing the creature on his back the same way a river tests a new stone. A lesser rider would have planted against that spin and been slung off by his own stiffness. Jack flowed with it, knees firm but not braced back, tall eyes level on the next point of the circle. The stallion hopped and jarred through short crow hops that thudded through the ground and up the fences into the bones of the watchers. Jack let the motion move through him. He didn't saw at the reins. He didn't drop his weight like an anchor. He rode as if riding were listening. A few more jumps, a few more thudding bucks, and then the pattern faltered. Diablo shook his neck with a savage, frustrated snort, and the snort ended as an ordinary breath. the circle that had been ragged and mean rounded out. The dirt under his hooves started telling the story of a track instead of a fight. Jack leaned forward the width of 2 fingers and spoke into the space between the ears. "We don't have to fight, buddy." He didn't say it like a promise he couldn't keep. He said it like a truth that had been waiting for both of them to hear it. One ear flicked back toward the voice. The other stayed forward, checking the ring, the people, the world. Diablo's stride stretched. He walked. The first 4 steps were suspicious, the next 4 were cautious, and then he was simply moving head-level breath, steadying to the old rhythm that horses invented before men ever dreamed of saddles. Silence fell like shade. The crowd that had whooped at Rex and hooted at Bravado now found themselves sitting too still, hands hanging in the air, nowhere to land. A man at the rail whispered not to anyone in particular. "I ain't never seen him step off calm." Emily pressed her fingers against her mouth. For a beat she thought she might cry, and then what she felt wasn't tears. It was a fierce, hot pride that startled her. She had believed quietly that Diablo could do this if someone offered him something other than a fight. She had not known the shape of that someone until now. Even Charles, who could make a grin look like mercy, forgot to raise the corners of his mouth. The mathematics of his morning were changing, and not in a way money could fix. Jack gave the lightest touch with his heel, not a command so much as a suggestion. Diablo answered with a slow, even circle along the fence. The stallion's head stayed straight. The ugly, habitual corkscrew of his neck smoothed away. 100 pairs of eyes followed them the way towns follow parades in places small enough to know themselves. No one spoke until Diablo completed the first lap. Then a voice, high, disbelieving, joyous, burst free near the back benches. "He's riding, Diablo." The words were a spark in dry grass. Sound rushed in. Cheers, whistles, the slap of hands on wood. A man clambered up onto the top rail for a better look and nearly toppled backward when someone else elbowed him aside. Down by the gate, the young riders who'd been thrown earlier shook their heads and laughed in a way that had more respect than bitterness in it. Emily let her hand drop from her mouth and smiled properly. "Good," she said, barely audible. "Good." Jack brought Diablo to the center and let him stand, the big body melting down out of alert into something that looked, if you were generous, like ease. He slid one hand forward along the neck and set his palm there, feeling the thud and flutter that belonged to this one life and no other. The horse blew a soft breath and lipped at the edge of the rein, as if tasting the quiet. Around them, the cheering didn't immediately die. It rolled and thinned and then swelled again. Because when a thing people were certain could not happen happens right in front of them, they have to teach themselves the shape of it in stages. The roar that had risen for Jack and Diablo was still spilling over the rails when Charles Whitmore came down off the platform like a man stepping off a gallows with the rope still around his neck. The color had drained from his face and then come roaring back, blotching his cheeks, climbing into his ears. He planted his boots hard enough to make dust jump, fists tightening until the knuckles showed through like chalk. "Doesn't count," he snapped the words hard and clipped as bullets. He shoved his voice over the crowd until it cracked the cheers in two. This game is for real men, not for crippled veterans. The words cut the air so cleanly, the next breath of the crowd stalled. A few people gasped. Others turned instinctively to Jack at the center of the ring. He sat there, steady in the saddle, a still point in the hot swirl face, calm eyes level only the slight pinch at one corner of his mouth, giving away that he'd heard every letter of it. A man near the front, thin, sunburned old hand rancher, put 2 fingers to his lips and whistled sharp. "You never said a damn thing about limits," he called. He rode him. That means he won. A woman lifted her chin beside him. What is a Whitmore's word worth if it breaks 10 minutes later? Murmurs spread in ripples, small waves, colliding, turning to chop. Some in the back nodded. Others frowned down at their boots as if ashamed of being in the room with what had just been said. Emily, fingers tight on the top rail, looked straight at her grandfather with a gaze as clear as ice water. That gaze had no pleading in it, no family softness, only fact. Charles felt the floor under him tilt. He had not planned for dissent. He scanned faces the way men used to scan the tree line for riders, not to see who was there, but to see who wasn't with him. He jabbed a finger toward the center. "Get him off my property," he said, voice rising. Now, Tom Briggs and Earl Simmons, the two yardmen who did whatever job their boss named, peeled off from the shade and stalked toward the ring gate. Tom's jaw worked. Earl rolled his shoulders once and flexed his hands like a ball player walking to the plate. The gate rasped open. They stepped inside with the assurance of men who believed they would never meet a problem they couldn't muscle. Jack tightened his fingers on the reins barely and did not move. Diablo's ears ticked toward the gate, then flattened and pricked again, undecided. The stallion's breathing had leveled out to something close to ordinary. Now it gusted harder, tasting the incoming weather. Jeers and whistles began in the bleachers. A few men and women slid off their benches and took up places along the fence near the gate. Not rioting, not threatening, just there. The feeling of a town shifting its weight to the other foot. Tom lifted a hand for Diablo's bridle. Off he grunted to Jack. "Mr. Whitmore says off." Jack's voice was mild. "Mr. Whitmore says a lot of things." Earl reached for the reins on the other side. Diablo's skin twitched under the touch. A muscle hopped in his shoulder. Jack didn't jerk him away or haul the horse's head up. He merely laid a hand lightly against the hot, strong curve of the neck and breathed out a slow spill of air that rolled down through the animal's body like a remembered river. Leave him, someone barked from the fence. He won. Let the man down in peace. Tom scowled. You don't make the rules. The crowd's noise thickened. Bodies pressed a little closer. Two teenagers scooted up onto the top rail for a better view. An older woman set a steadying hand on the nearest post as if she might have to hold the fence together by will. Jack let a beat pass and then leaned forward and scratched the base of Diablo's mane with his gloveless fingers. "Let's go, buddy," he said, soft enough that the words didn't carry past the first ring of onlookers. He turned the horse toward the gate. Tom and Earl shifted to block. Jack slid his right leg back, gave the smallest cue. Diablo, reading the man like a simple map, stepped off straight, unhurried, like a soldier who had decided he could leave this fight without losing the war. At the gate, Jack swung his leg over and dropped lightly to the ground. Tom moved, then quick to catch the bridle, confident the horse was free and he could reclaim control. Diablo flicked an ear, pivoted his long neck away from the reaching hand, and fell in beside Jack, so close the man could have leaned his shoulder against the stallion's ribs. The big black matched the ex-Marine's uneven cadence without missing a stride, 1-2. And the faint stutter the way a friend falls in line without commenting on a limp. "Stop," Charles thundered. "That horse is mine." Diablo didn't stop. He didn't even flick an ear at the voice. His nostrils flared, pulling in heat and dust. His ears laid back in a neat, angry line. Foam flecked his lips again, but it wasn't panic now, it was statement. The crowd made a sound that was half laugh, half astonishment. The two yardmen started after Jack and the horse, only to find their path crowded by townspeople who had drifted in front of them with a studied kind of accident. No one put a hand on them. No one pushed. But there wasn't room to pass either, and the looks those men met were not the looks of a crowd asking for autographs. They were the looks people give when they've already chosen a side. Charles thrust a step-forward voice, cracking out another order, and stopped. Emily was there, 3 feet from him, small compared to his height, but immovable. Others had joined her, a line of bodies that might as well have been a barbed wire fence. Looks like Diablo chose someone else. Emily said, pitched just loud enough to travel. Her grandfather's jaw bunched. Rage jumped in his lip and made it tremble. He could have shoved. He could have risked it. But the ring was full of cameras and phones, and the morning's math had already turned against him. He swallowed the shove. He swallowed the words that came with it. Jack didn't look back. He walked, and the stallion walked with him out the gate, across the yard, toward the road that cut a straight line through the scrub. 100 pairs of eyes watched 2 silhouettes, one man, one horse, draw down to shapes in the glare, then to marks, then to a shimmer where heat swallowed them. Emily stayed where she was and watched the shimmer a long beat longer than needed. She was thinking of a track 3 years ago, the scream of metal and horseflesh in a tangle, the way Diablo had stood over a man who didn't rise. She was thinking of Jack's eyes in the ring when he'd said, "We don't have to fight." The resemblance was not in color or shape. It was in the old clean ache you can spot across a room if you've carried even a sliver of it yourself. Behind her, Charles had gone still, as if the heat had fired him to glass. His hand shook once where it hung at his side, then again. Losing money in private was an insult he could swallow. Losing face in public was a wound. He turned very slowly back toward the platform, and the crowd's noise scudding over him like grit in wind. Somewhere behind his eyes, a plan began to coalesce, sharp-edged and mean. There were other ways to take back what was his. Emily felt the shiver of that plan, as if the air had gone a degree colder. She stepped off the rail and down into the dust, already deciding she wouldn't let the next act be written without her in it. The ring dissolved into knots of talkers after Jack and Diablo vanished down the road. People stood in little circles, their hands making shapes that matched their sentences. "Did you see?" "He just..." And then, "The horse?" The noise bounced from board to board and rose up the stable walls in a hollow buzzing. Charles strode toward his office with the measured gait of a man who has to count to 10 between every step, or else he'll start breaking things. The door slammed. The buzz swallowed the sound and kept going. Emily slid off the fence and landed lightly, dust puffing around her boots. Her crossbody bag thumped her hip. The wind had stuck a few strands of hair to the sweat at her temple, and she brushed them back with the crook of one finger's eyes, moving not hurried, but purposeful across the yard. She didn't look toward the office. She looked for a line out. At the side gate where deliveries came and went, the traffic was thin. She slipped through it, the latch clinking shut behind her. On the far side of the fence, the world widened back into open country. The road's gravel shouldered on a little ways, then fell into bare dirt, the color of rust and old brick. The afternoon was sliding toward evening, and the light going honey-soft along the tops of the mesquite. She walked fast until the crowd sounds flattened behind her. Then she saw them. 100 yards down the road, the man and the horse were a quiet picture. Jack, leading Diablo's head, dropped to a loose line, their shadows side by side and long. The stallion stopped to lip at a tuft of roadside grass. Jack waited patient, as if he'd planned to stop exactly there. She heard herself call before she decided to. "Hey," Jack turned. Surprise flickered over his face and was gone. He took in her Whitmore cheekbones. The pale eyes, the bag strap across the chest, cataloged the facts, not the threat. His hand stayed on the lead knuckles, easy against the leather. "You're Whitmore's granddaughter," he said. Not accusation, just a thing that was true. "I am," Emily said, "and I'm not on his side." Diablo lifted his head and breathed at her, warm and curious. He tasted the air around her wrist and then went back to the grass. She stopped a few feet back, gave the horse the kind of polite space she wished more people gave one another. "For what it's worth," she said, finding the words as she stepped closer, "you did something no one else could do." Jack looked past her toward the stable roofs. "Or wouldn't be allowed to," he said, dry and almost smiled. She shook her head. "No. You did it because you weren't trying to win a fight." He studied her a moment. The afternoon had weathered his face with a thin glaze of dust. Sweat had drawn darker patches down the front of his shirt. He wasn't on his guard the way some men got when they heard the name Whitmore, not with the horse between them. But he wasn't careless either. There was a steadiness in him that made her think of the way fences keep holding even after the corner posts' wrought tension carried clean along a wire. "You know his story," she said, nodding toward the stallion. "I know some," Jack answered. "I've seen enough to guess more." She took a breath that tasted like heat and pasture. 3 years ago, she began at the Midland track. Diablo went down. He'd been running like the ground would break for him. Then a mare beside him clipped and he stumbled and there was nowhere to go. Tom Larkin, his trainer, went under. He didn't get back up. She didn't dress it in sweet words. There weren't any. The memory had the bright, terrible clarity of a bottle dropping and breaking in slow motion. After that, Diablo wouldn't let anyone near him. He didn't just spook, he fought hard. He learned that when the world hurts you, you hurt it back first. Jack's gaze traveled over the horse's withers and the healed nicks along the shoulder where old brushes had left their stories for the dark, soft skin at the corner of the eye. "And Charles believes in force," Emily said simply. "Believes a horse exists to be dominated. Believes pain teaches faster." She swallowed. "He doesn't believe in trauma, not for animals. Maybe not for people either." Jack looked down at the dirt until the red grains came into focus. He remembered the way a blast wave turns the air inside out. He remembered the stillness after the world's volume turned down to nothing but the thud in your own bones. People had told him to walk it off. People had pressed pills in his palm. No one had said, "We can move slow until your heart remembers how to trust your ribs again." You gave him something Emily said. You gave him a reason to believe a human again. The sentence landed somewhere between them. He felt it strike light, not a blow, like a note on a tuning fork carries through wood. He cleared his throat. "I saw something in his eyes," he admitted. "Same thing I see in mine when I catch a mirror by accident." She didn't ask what. She didn't have to. His mouth had already told her enough a half-inch of tightness where a scar wasn't the silence he sat inside when the yard got loud. A pickup rattled past on the main road, throwing pale dust across the ditch. Emily glanced behind them and lowered her voice. "I should warn you," she said. "My grandfather won't let this go. Diablo isn't just a horse to him. He's a billboard. He's proof that Charles Whitmore can't be beaten on his own land." Jack's smile was small and tired and not unkind. "I survived Helmand," he said. "Texas and I will get along." She didn't laugh. "He doesn't fight fair," she said. "He sends other men to do it. And he has money to make trouble last a long time." Jack rubbed Diablo's neck, felt the strong muscles fold and refold under skin. "Then we'll take it slow, me and him," he said. "We're both better at slow now." Emily's eyes softened. "You'll need a place to keep him that isn't the back lot at Hank's. He deserves a stall. And you deserve sleep that isn't in a truck seat." He opened his mouth and then closed it. Pride was a stubborn animal. It had kept him upright through worse than awkward offers. "I'll figure it out," he said. "You don't have to figure it out alone," she said. "There's a back pasture on my grandmother's side that my grandfather never bothered to fence. Spring water, good shade." "No one uses it?" He'd noticed, Jack said. "He notices defiance," Emily said. "He's slower with kindness." They stood without speaking for a few beats, as if the conversation itself had needed to rest its feet. Diablo nosed at the hem of Jack's shirt and snorted in a way that made them both smile. He had carried war all afternoon and now wanted salt. "Do you have proof?" Jack asked finally. He didn't have to specify of what. Emily nodded toward a shape in her bag. "I have enough to start a conversation he won't like," she said. "My grandmother had me read the will once when I was 13. I remember the clause about honor because it sounded like something out of a Western that didn't apply to real life." She lifted one shoulder. "Turns out it might." He studied her a breath longer and then said, "You don't need me to tell you this, but you'll make enemies if you pick this fight." "I had them already," Emily said. "They just thought I was quiet." She looked past him at the long strip of road burning toward evening. "And I'm not." The wind shifted and brought them the far, faint, tinny roar of the crowd still at the stables. The day was tilting and the edges of things felt a little looser, as if the screws of the world had been backed off a quarter turn. "I should go," she said. "If he doesn't see me for an hour, he'll start asking where I've been." Jack nodded. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For telling me the part of the story no one writes on posters." She smiled then, small reel. "You're welcome." She took a step, then another, the dust taking her boot prints in and keeping them. At the bend of the road, she glanced back. Jack had turned his head toward Diablo, saying something she couldn't hear. The stallion listened as if words were a salt block he could lick. "Be careful," she called, softer than the wind. He lifted his hand. "You too." She walked on until the curve hid them from each other. Behind her, the land smelled like sun-warmed creosote and old hay. Ahead, the fence lines ran in patient straight lines, back to the house where a man was already planning the next bad idea. Jack stood for a moment longer in the slow wash of late light. He slid his hand up Diablo's neck and under the coarse fall of mane. The horse leaned into the touch and blew a breath that warmed the place just above Jack's wrist. The feeling for a fraction was so simple, it was almost unbearable. "Looks like we made a friend," Jack said. Diablo flicked an ear as if to say he'd reserve judgment, and then bumped Jack's shoulder with the soft weight of his muzzle. They turned together and headed toward town, and the road blushing under the sunset, the first evening breeze stirring the dust into little ghosts that rose, drifted, and were gone. The night had settled heavy over Dusty Creek, pulling the last shreds of daylight down into the black seams of the desert. The lot where Jack had parked his old Ford was a wedge of emptiness between the abandoned service garage and a low stand of mesquite. Moonlight glazed the cracked asphalt and the dirt edges in silver. The truck squatted in stillness, its dull paint almost blending into the pale light. A few feet away, Diablo stood loosely tied to a makeshift post, nothing more than a sun-bleached plank driven into the ground. The knot was loose, the lead slack. The stallion could have tested it if he'd wanted, but instead he nosed lazily at the hay in an old feed tub, chewing with a steady rhythm. His black coat drank the moonlight and gave it back in faint blue glints whenever he shifted. The wind came low and dry out of the west, slipping around the edges of the deserted garage. Somewhere inside, loose sheets of corrugated tin rattled and knocked against each other, sounding like impatient hands drumming on a table. Jack sat on the open tailgate, the bulk of his frame shadowed under the brim of his cap. He had a worn rag in one hand, the other holding the saddle he'd stripped from Diablo earlier. He worked the cloth in small circular motions over the leather eyes on the task, but ears always open. Every so often his gaze would lift and slide toward the dark edges of the lot, scanning without turning his head. Years of habit kept him alert, even in moments meant for rest. He wasn't the only one moving in the dark. From the road beyond the mesquite, 3 shapes separated themselves from the deeper shadows and began crossing toward him. The lead figure was broad and upright, his pace unhurried but deliberate, Charles Whitmore. The moon caught the gleam of a dark leather coat over a pressed shirt. His hat brim came low enough to hide most of his expression. But the set of his shoulders and the way his hands hung stiff at his sides made his intent plain. Behind him came Tom Briggs and Earl Simmons. Tom's right arm curled around a coiled lariat, the rope heavy and dark against his shirt, one end trailing just enough to whisper over the ground. Earl carried a cattle prod in his right hand, the business end already buzzing faintly with a mean blue light. When he thumbed the switch, the crackle cut the silence like a nest of angry hornets. They tried to keep their steps soft, but the gravel here was too loose. The crunch under their boots carried in the quiet, riding the wind straight toward Jack. Charles slowed, raising his hand in a wordless order. Tom and Earl peeled outward, taking the angles like they'd rehearsed it. Tom drifting left toward Diablo's head. Earl circling wide to the right, putting himself in position to block the only easy exit. Take him. Charles said, his voice pitched low but hard enough to snap. Tonight. Tom's hands tightened around the rope as he came closer to Diablo, eyes fixed on the stallion's neck. He had the look of a man convinced that surprise and speed would win him the day. Earl shifted his grip on the prod, watching the horse's hindquarters waiting for an opening. The first move belonged to Diablo. When Tom lifted the loop to toss it over the stallion's ears, flicked back, a muscle jumped along his jaw, and the rest of him came alive in an instant. He lunged sideways with a raw surge of muscle, jerking the lead rope taut and snapping Tom's balance out from under him. Tom hit the ground flat on his back, the lariat tumbling from his hands as dust puffed up around his shoulders. Earl rushed in from behind, swinging the cattle prod forward. Diablo's head came up his body, turning under him with the precision of a trained fighter. His rear hooves lashed out in a clean, brutal arc. One caught Earl square on the forearm, and the shock of the blow wrenched the prod from his grip. It skittered across the packed dirt and died with a hiss, the blue light winking out. Both men staggered back, breath loud and uneven in the night air. In the space between them, the stallion stood, planted, his breath pouring out in white streams under the moon. Ears pinned, flat eyes, bright as molten coin. Jack was moving before the dust had settled. He stepped in beside Diablo, his limp barely noticeable in the deliberate pace. One hand came up to rest against the horse's neck, fingers stroking the tense line of muscle there. His voice was steady and low. "Easy," he murmured. "You're all right." The stallion's head dipped fractionally, nostrils still flaring, but the tension in his shoulders eased notch by notch. His focus stayed on the 2 men who had tried to take him, but he no longer looked like he was choosing which to trample first. Jack lifted his eyes to the man still standing back in the shadows. "You can't buy everything, Whitmore," he said. The words hung in the stillness like a shot in a canyon. Charles stopped where he was, the line of his jaw tightening. Behind him, Tom and Earl exchanged a glance and stayed where they'd landed, neither eager to step forward again. For a moment, nobody moved. The garage's loose tin rattled once in the breeze. Then Charles took a slow step back, his boots grinding in the gravel. His mouth pressed into a hard, bloodless line. "We're not done, Dawson," he said, and the threat was as plain as his name. He turned sharply, jerking his head toward the others. Tom scooped up his rope, Earl retrieved the dead prod, and they fell in behind him. The three shapes shrank as they crossed back toward the road, swallowed by the black edge of the mesquite, until only the sound of their boots and the wind remained. Jack let out the breath he'd been holding and ran his palm once more down Diablo's neck. The horse blew out a heavy gust, shaking his mane as though flinging off the last of the fight. "Looks like you just won your first battle in this town," Jack said, the corner of his mouth curling. Diablo snorted a sound somewhere between agreement and impatience. That was when Jack noticed it, a glow moving across the far stretch of the road. Headlights bouncing over ruts the shape of a truck riding the beam. Not Whitmore's Too Small, Too New. The engine noise carried in the still air, growing louder with each second. Jack's shoulders eased, but his mind stayed sharp. Night wasn't over yet. Whatever this was, it wasn't here by accident. He rested a hand on the post, untying Diablo's lead with quick, practiced movements. The moon washed over the lot, turning every shadow into a question mark. And somewhere up that dirt road, the answers were coming straight toward him. By sunrise, Dusty Creek was wide awake. Word of the midnight scuffle had traveled the way gossip does in small towns, on boot heels and over diner counters, through text threads and the faint blue glow of videos replayed on cracked phone screens. When the courthouse clock coughed up 8 sharp notes into the pale morning, and the town's little square was already packed. Charles Whitmore stood at the top of the City Hall steps in a slate gray suit that fit like a threat. The years fell away from him. They're the old rodeo champion's posture, the land baron's certainty. In his right hand, he held a small wireless microphone like a judge's gavel. Below him swelled a sea of hats and shoulders cowboys with sunburnt necks, feed store buyers with clipboards tucked under their arms, ranch wives in pearl-snap shirts, teenagers who'd been there yesterday when the black stallion finally carried a rider. Faces he knew, faces he owned or had until the night. He lifted the mic, cleared his throat, and sent his voice booming into the morning. "I, Charles Whitmore, hereby declare yesterday's wager invalid. There is no winner." Sound rolled across the square, not the clean cheer he'd expected, but a scratchy chorus of disbelief. A few whistles low and sharp. People turned to each other in quick, suspicious little motions, as if to confirm they'd heard what they'd heard. An old man in the front row frowned, his mouth going hard. In the back, some kid muttered, "That ain't right," and the phrase flew off, catching on other tongues. Charles drew breath to continue something about technicalities, about safety standards, when a new sound threaded the air. Not boots, not voices. An engine smooth and confident, idling low. Everyone turned as the black SUV glided in from Maine and eased to the curb at the foot of the steps. The driver's door opened, and a man in a deep blue suit stepped out, one hand carrying a leather portfolio. He had the look of glass, polished, reflective, and not there to be liked. His shoes made no sound on the concrete as he climbed. He didn't bother with the microphone. He spoke in a courtroom voice that traveled cleanly without amplification. "Good morning. My name is Robert Ames. I represent Miss Emily Whitmore." A ripple moved through the crowd at the name. Emily herself stood near the front with her arms at her sides, chin-level eyes on her grandfather. She looked smaller than the moment, but only until you met those eyes. Ames opened the portfolio and lifted out a thick sheaf of papers. "I'll be brief," he said. "The last will and testament of the late Martin Whitmore, father to Mr. Whitmore, contains a specific clause. It states that if the direct heir acts in a manner that dishonors the name of the family, or uses force or coercion to do harm to an innocent, managerial control of Whitmore stables, immediately transfers to the next lawful heir. He let the words sit. People shifted. Some craned hungry for a better view. The square had gone quiet enough to hear the distant rattle of a feed truck up on Ridge Road. The next lawful heir, Ames continued, is Miss Emily Whitmore. The quiet broke. Gasps, exclamations. Heads pivoted toward Emily as if pulled on wires. She didn't move. She didn't smile. Her face wore the set calm of a rider lowering her hands and asking a wound-up horse to walk. Charles gave a short, disbelieving laugh that didn't get past his teeth. "This is a stunt," he said, but the mic didn't make the word bigger. It made it thinner. Ames lifted another packet from his case and raised it chest high. Last night, he said, there were witnesses and cameras at the old garage lot out on County Road 6. We have sworn statements, photographs, and videos showing Mr. Whitmore instructing two men to use force in an attempt to seize property and threaten an innocent party, the man you all know as Jack Dawson. A low wave of talking rolled forward, bumped against the steps, and rebounded. "Saw it," someone said to no one in particular. "I saw that blue spark jump in." A woman in a sunflower dress pressed a hand to her chest and shook her head once, as if the motion might dislodge the picture. Color crawled up Charles's neck again. He tried for the grin, the old Whitmore charm that had greased so many bad days. It didn't fit his face. Ames didn't press. He didn't have to. He set the papers into the hands of the city clerk, a neat woman with a pencil behind her ear and the expression of someone who had filed divorces before breakfast. She slid them into a manila folder with a practiced swipe. Emily took one step up onto the first stair. "Yesterday you did both," she said to her grandfather, not needing the microphone at all. "You disgraced our name, and you tried to do harm. Our grandfather's will is clear. From this morning on, Whitmore Stables falls under my management." A sound like a collective exhale filled the square. Some clapped tentative at first, then with palms that grew sure. Others didn't clap, but they didn't boo either. They stood very still, as if trying to feel which way the wind had turned. On the edge of the crowd, Jack rested a hand on Diablo's neck. He'd kept to the alleys on the way, in avoiding attention. The stallion stood with his head a little low, and the long muscles along his shoulders relaxed. The two of them could have been statues, if not for the occasional flick of a tail at a fly. Jack didn't call out. He didn't lift a hand. He watched the woman on the steps, who had told him the part of the story nobody printed on posters. Emily's eyes flicked his way for a heartbeat. She dipped her head, acknowledgement, thanks, and an apology none of them needed to speak. Jack answered with the smallest tilt of chin. Up above, Charles looked over the heads of the people who had applauded him for years. He saw some who had signed contracts in his office, men he'd bailed out in dry years, families whose kids had ridden the gentlest sorrels at the fall festival. He expected to find their eyes and borrow their loyalty. He found instead 100 faces turned not toward him, but toward the young woman who had just said enough. His smile broke altogether. He stepped backward one stair, then another, the microphone sagging at his side. He turned without ceremony and walked stiff back to his waiting car. The driver had the door open before he reached it. The door shut with an expensive final thunk. The black SUV slid back onto Main, then turned out toward the ranch road, its glossy paint swallowing the morning. Ames closed his case. The clerk took her copy down the hall to stamp. People started talking all at once, relief and suspicion and curiosity pouring out of them like water from a gutter after the first hard rain in months. Emily stood on the stair a second longer, then stepped down off the public stage and back into the heat with everyone else. The sun was fully up now, bright enough to burn outlines into things. For the first time, Whitmore's stables wasn't a place you had to say his name to enter. It belonged to whatever would be built next. She headed toward the edge of the crowd, where a black horse and a quiet man were waiting. For a breath after the clerk's stamp hit paper in the city hall, the square fell into a hush that felt almost like respect. Then the noise resumed, but softer, as if the whole town had agreed to keep its voices on the backs of their tongues for an hour. Charles had already gone. No one followed him to the curb. No one put a hand on his sleeve and told him to stay and fight it. The empty space he left behind took a few seconds to fill. And even then, it felt oddly cold, as if a shadow had been lifted and the ground needed a moment to remember sunlight. Emily met Jack beneath the thin shade of a hackberry. Diablo shifted one hoof and then the other, bored with politics, ready for hay, and the comfort of a stall that didn't smell like fear. Emily held a thick envelope in both hands, as if it had a temperature she had to be careful with. "You won," she said. "This is yours." He watched her face before he watched the envelope. He could hear the check even through the paper, a whisper of weight. He slid it free, glanced at the number that had dragged this whole town out of bed, and gave a short, surprised huff of a laughter that sounded like relief, finally remembering the door. "I'll take what I need," he said, slipping the check back inside. "Enough to clear the bank on my father's land, enough to fix the roofs and the fences, and get a decent vet to look at this knee. The rest, put it into a fund. Veterans who need a hand, horses that need a second chance." Around them, the listeners who weren't trying to look like listeners made little approving noises. A hat tipped. A woman in a denim skirt squeezed her daughter's hand. The town was relearning itself in public and liked for the moment what it saw. Emily blinked a smile, starting in one corner of her mouth and traveling carefully to the other. "Are you sure?" she asked. $1 million doesn't come around twice. Money's a tool, Jack said. Tools are only good when you know what you're building. He nodded toward Diablo. Some things weigh more than zeros. Her gaze went soft, like trust. He took a sideways step toward the stallion and slid his fingers into the thick base of the mane the way you do when you're telling a horse something and need your hand to say it too. Diablo leaned the heavy, deliberate lean of an animal choosing contact. His breath warmed the fabric of Jack's shirt. If the town needed a statue for this day, they already had the pose. Jack spoke so low, the words were almost a vibration. "We both get another shot, you and me?" The horse nickered a small private sound that drew a couple of smiles from the people close enough to hear it. Some moments don't need applause. They ask only to be witnessed. Emily opened the envelope again, and with a pen from her bag, wrote a number in the corner of the check, smaller than the number printed across its middle, but big enough to move earth. She tore off a receipt for the clerk and tucked the rest back in for Jack. "We'll set up the fund this week," she said. "Local bank will match a portion. I can lean on a few friends at the vet school for the rescue side. We'll start with hay and farrier bills, then training, then placements." Jack nodded. He wasn't a man who liked talking futures until the hinges were hung, but he believed her in the particular way you believe people who have already stepped between you and a storm once, when no one asked them to. A clatter of hooves on pavement echoed from the far end of the square. Some kid bringing a barrel horse too close to town for the thrill of it. Diablo twitched an ear and then decided the sound belonged to other horses' problems. Emily looked past the hackberry at the open blue. "I called the stables," she said. "Your stall is ready?" "Mine?" Jack asked. "His," she corrected gently, tipping her head at Diablo. "But yes, yours too if you want it." There's a cot in the office and a shower that hisses like a rattler but runs hot. We'll sort out something better by week's end. Jack hesitated long enough to be honest, not so long as to insult the offer. All right, he said. They started across the square together, Diablo falling in step between them like a black current. People parted without thinking, and then realizing what they were doing, made a ceremony of it, touching brims, saying mornin', offering awkward, heartfelt congratulations that felt like the first bricks in a new road. By the time they reached the corner, the sun had gone from gentle to full. It got into their clothes and their bones and made everything smell like warm leather and dust and the patience of old wood. In that light, the stallion's coat looked less like night and more like depth, like something you could go into and come out of changed. At the edge of the square, Jack stopped and turned so that the wind hit them sideways. Diablo lifted his head and looked at what he could not name the horizon, the line where one life gives way to another. The stallion's whinny rose pure and strong and rolled out over the low buildings across the scrub toward the invisible riverbed that only ran in spring. People turned to follow it with their faces like sunflowers. If this were a picture show, the camera would pull back now, 2 figures and a horse in a heat-shimmered town, and the long flag of a dust devil unwinding far off the sky so blue it seemed as though it could be broken by a sound. It would hold for a beat for 2 on the simple geometry of trust. But life rarely cuts to black on time. It rolls on, and so did they. A week later, the Dawson place smelled like sawdust and promise. The roofs had fresh tin. The fences had new posts tamped into stubborn earth lines, pulled tight enough to sing when you plucked them. A handful of men and women in faded service tees worked in the shade of the barn, measuring with thumb widths, laughing with the careful softness of people who knew what hard laughter could wake. A bay pony with a bad pastern stood in the first stall, ears flicking, while a vet student wrapped the leg in clean white. Diablo watched from the end of the aisle, interested but not intrusive, as if he decided the little one needed to own his space. Jack set down a post hole digger and wiped his arm across his forehead. He looked at the shape of the new round pen they'd laid out with twine. Emily came up beside him, Boots' dusty hair pulled back a clipboard somehow, already smudged with feed. "You started something," she said, and the words were pleased, not surprised. Jack followed Diablo's gaze to the pony, to the students, to the men setting a beam true. "We started something," he said. Diablo tossed his head and stepped out into the afternoon, the sun cutting him into a stripe of light and a stripe of shadow. And for once, both stripes belonged exactly where they were.
Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know your favorite part. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And don't miss out. Hit the notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content. Your support truly means the world to us.